Thank you for attending Implementing Issue 2, Adult Use Marijuana Reforms and Future Challenges. The event is hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. The chat is disabled, but you may submit questions at any time. Please note, however, that there is limited time available for Q&A during the webinar. Second, automatic closed captioning has been enabled for the event. To change how you view the transcription or to hide it, click Show Caption in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel as soon as possible following the event. A link will be shared with all registrants via email as soon as it is available. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. Doug?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks everybody at the center for helping to give us this opportunity to connect and hear from some terrific panelists on implementing issue 2. I am just going to do a brief introduction. I'm Doug Berman. I'm the executive director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, and I've been incredibly grateful for getting participants like we have here, experts, to talk on topics like this, and also for the incredible work that our research team has done. I would highly encourage everybody interested in Ohio marijuana reform to go to the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center's pages, and especially our research pages. We've done dozens of reports both before the passage of issue 2 and since, to just try to deepen understanding of both what issue 2 has done and hasn't done in a variety of ways. That's largely what we're talking about here. I almost find it hard to believe it's been a full year already since issue 2 passed and became law here in the state of Ohio. I'm so excited to have a chance to reflect on a year in, especially because I'm not going to do much of the reflecting. I'm going to turn it over. We have the honor of having Jeremy Noble from Crane's Business. He's the finance and legal affairs reporter for Crane's Cleveland business. He's also been covering cannabis issues for nearly a decade, and he's going to be serving as our moderator. He'll introduce our other panelists, and I'll just get to join the rest of you as participants. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Jeremy, so much for taking the moderator mic and leading us through what I'm sure is going to be a very informative discussion.
Yeah, Doug, thank you very much for having us. Yeah, we do have a pretty great panel here, so I'm just going to do some quick introductions for everybody. First, we have Andrew Makoski, who is Chief Legal Counsel for the Division of Cannabis Control, which is the state's cannabis regulatory body. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. We have Kat Packer, Distinguished Cannabis Policy Practitioner in Residence at The Ohio State University's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, and Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation at the Drug Policy Alliance, which is a New York-based nonprofit. Hi, Kat. Thanks for joining. Next, we have Shalene Title, Distinguished Cannabis Policy Practitioner in Residence for the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, as well as founder and director of the Parabola Center for Law and Policy, which is a think tank in Boston. Shalene, thanks for joining. And last, but certainly not least, we have the illustrious Tom Herron, a partner and chair of the cannabis practice for the law firm France Ward. He's also spokesman for the OCAN Industry Trade Group, and y'all might know him as a key figure behind the adult use referendum that Ohio voters approved in 2023. Tom, thanks for joining us as well.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
So to get things started, I thought we'd get each of you to just share some general thoughts about the status of the marijuana program today. You know, perhaps each of you could just share your thoughts regarding how far we've come with setting up rules and regulations in Ohio, and maybe some, thoughts on priorities on that front moving forward as we look at what's left to be done. From there, we'll probably dig into some of these things in a bit more detail. Tom, I thought maybe we'd start with you as our industry representative, then maybe go to Shalene and Kat, and we'll wrap it off with Andrew. So Tom, tell us a little bit about what you think about the program, just as, in terms of where we are today, where we've come from, and what we have left to do.
Well, look, I think to level set, we are light years ahead of where we were a year ago, certainly 2 years ago at this point, right? We have an adult use program that is up and running, thanks in large part to the hard work of the folks at the division like Andrew and his team, who have spent the last, better part of the last year and a half, writing rules to allow for the conversion of existing, licensees from medical only to what are called dual use licensees, meaning they can produce and sell for both medical marijuana market as well as the adult use market. We are in process of authorizing an additional 130-ish dispensaries throughout the state. Prices are still high, which happens in every single market, by the way. Those prices will continue to come down as supply increases, right? As cultivators build out additional space, as more of these dispensaries get online. So I think we're in a really good position here. We've had a more profitable or larger rollout by dollar value than both Michigan and Illinois when you compare sort of this stage in the adult use life cycle. So that says to me that we've got a lot of runway left from a business and industry perspective to compete with some of the top adult use markets in the country.
Shalene, you want to go next? Tell us a little bit about, just like where we're at today and where we still have to go. What do you think?
Well, I'm primarily filled with empathy for the regulators because I think this period is the hardest. I definitely remember from my time in Massachusetts that there was extraordinary pressure to speed up, even though it felt like we were going at warp speed, writing rules and moving forward with implementation. But secondly, I would say this is a frustrating time for anybody who cares about social justice and racial equity, because the top thing that you will hear from advocates who care about those things is whatever you do, please don't start by saying we're going to implement sales. We're going to allow the existing operators to start sales, and then we'll worry about the social equity and justice pieces later. And this is really when you find out just because something is written in the law doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And this is when you find out where the priorities really lie in different states. And when I was a regulator, this was a mistake that we made. We started out with priority, we thought, for both social equity and existing operators. Ended up being only existing operators because they had so many advantages. And then in the meantime, those social equity operators that by definition have the most disadvantages were left far behind. And so it kind of feels like that's happening yet again. It feels like Groundhog Day is really tough to watch. And I'll add that when it comes to the taxes that are being collected, fortunately, I think that criminal justice reform hopefully will be done sooner than later, but it can kind of be done effectively anytime. But when it comes to industry participation, it is irresponsible to wait, because the longer you wait to spend social equity funds on something like grants and loans to social equity participants, the less effective those funds will be, because they can't go far when you're entering a market that is already entrenched and dominated by certain operators. And I think it's similar with job programs, when people are already taking those jobs and they're already gaining experience. And so it's tough to balance all of these different areas, but I think at the least I would love to just see a timeline or a goal for when we can expect the social equity pieces of the law to come into place.
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to talk a little bit more about that bit here in just a little bit. So definitely more on that. Kat, do you want to give us some of your thoughts just on where we're at today?
Yeah, sure. I think in general, I am pleased to see the state of Ohio join other states in allowing for adult use cannabis, that we're not categorically a prohibitionist state anymore. I do think that that's critically important, in part because this is a voter initiative passed by about 57% of the voters. And I know that this is something politically that was rather contentious in Ohio prior to the passage of adult use legalization. I know that there were lots of legislators in Ohio that were opposed to legalization, opposed to the campaign itself. And despite that opposition, Ohio still has an adult use cannabis program. And so I do think that is progress. But I share Shalene's sentiment and having frustration with the what seems like the prioritization of business opportunity for existing operators, while there is simultaneously seemingly no action on the components of the social equity program. And it's important to note that this was not like a side project of the initiative itself. There are only 4 express purposes in the initiative. One of those express purposes essentially was to create a regulated adult use market to limit the transportation of cannabis out of state. And the last 2 were really about funding social equity and improving social equity. And so half of the initiative itself and its express purpose is about reinvesting into communities. And I know that we use this term equity, and a lot of times we're talking about market equity and opportunity to participate in the market itself. But the reality is that the way that the social equity provisions were written into issue 2, equity extends far beyond licensing opportunities in the industry. There are provisions in issue 2 that are supposed to fund criminal justice reform, fund things like education and legal aid. And we know that there are communities all throughout Ohio who are in need. And so I think that there is an equal need for prioritization of all of these other provisions of issue 2 that have not been equally prioritized to date.
No, I think that's a good overview. Andrew, now I'd like to flip it to you. Just from the regulatory perspective, you want to give us some thoughts just on where we stand today, maybe what's already been done, and then after that, I'm going to ask you a little bit about just how the rulemaking process works. But just give me your thoughts on just where we're at today, maybe what's already been done, and how everyone's thinking about the future.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think as the regulator that's sort of on this panel, our goals are maybe a little bit different than a lot of places. And one of the things that we look at as the metrics that we judge success by is, are we meeting the deadlines that are explicitly outlined in the statutes that we are meant to enforce? And I think that based on that type of metric, we really did what we were supposed to do. We provided rules on time, provided applications on time. We began adult use sales earlier than I think was even projected or was required from that standpoint. And then the other piece of that is, are we enacting the statute as it was kind of meant to be done? And I think that from that did everything that we could to do that. Location of the new licenses that are coming online, sort of equal playing field and the availability for all of the licensees that are in the marketplace and have these licenses to get access to those items, and also to ensure that the products that we are producing, that we are still sort of maintaining the medical requirements when it comes to product quality, testing, making sure that the items that do get out into the marketplace are safe, tested as they have always kind of meant to be. So by that standpoint, I think we're really proud of the work that we've already put together. We know that there's a long way to go on a lot of these pieces. The statute is not fully implemented yet, and we are continuing to kind of work and make sure that those pieces are done. Not to jump ahead too far, but you mentioned the rulemaking process. The rulemaking process in Ohio goes through a lot of stages. There's various steps that sort of need to be done. And we took the strategy pretty early on that we need to carve this up. We can't reasonably meet the deadlines that are in the statute unless we are able to successfully figure out where the priorities are going to lie. So the first rules that we wrote were specific to the licensing process, were specific to the application process, were specific to getting those parts across the line first. The second set of rules that we put together were having to do with the structure, the implementation of security, structural quality requirements of the actual facilities themselves. And the next few rules packages that we're targeting have a lot more to do with the operations side. They have to do with, new product types, new product testing, as well as packaging and labeling, advertising rules to meet what the statute is kind of put together for us. So we've been moving these packages through at various stages with a very kind of explicit goal of, we put these in different packages in order to make sure that we are meeting the statutory requirements that are put in front of us. So I think that we're happy with what we've done. I think that, anytime you look back, you could find a lot of things that you would do differently, but it was a difficult task that was kind of laid in front of us. I'm glad that some people have been on the regulatory side. You know how difficult it can be to get your rules packages together to meet all of those particular deadlines. And we worked pretty hard to make sure that we were doing that. So that was what we were proud of, and we've got more work to do for sure.
Is there anything else you want to, or that you could add, just in terms of, helping people understand like why this process, can take some time? I think reasonably speaking, we would understand that putting a lot of these rules together would take some time. But at the same time, I do think some people just, look at issue 2 passing in 2023 and wonder, like, why is this taking so long? Andrew, is there anything else you just want to add, just in terms of, like, how regulators are being thoughtful about this process, just maybe the layers of approvals that we have to go through, right? Because these laws have to go through a JCAR process, right? It's not like DCC just says, okay, we're going to do this, and you can't snap your fingers and get it done, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The rulemaking process doesn't even start at JCAR; it starts even before that. So any rule that we are going to implement, we can just use the applications as sort of an example, and what we did with that. It starts essentially with a draft that goes out to the public at large. We call it early stakeholder feedback, but it's really open to anybody that is able to see it. Our website has, these are the proposed rules. This is the stages that they're in, and it's at that point that we put our first thoughts kind of out into the ether. And those are usually already pretty well baked. We sort of have to have a fulsome idea of what these rules are going to be, at least as they relate to the individual topics that they're talking about. So before we even put something out into the public for feedback, we need to have an overall structure of what this program is going to look like. So, in December, when this becomes an effective statute and hasn't been modified by the legislature, we began, here's how we're going to design the application process. That's the first thing through the gate. So we spent a month kind of putting together our thoughts on it. And in January, we put out into, the world, here's the application process, is what we're going to do and how we're going to approach it. And we take a couple of weeks to collect that feedback and then make modifications. Once those modifications are done, we have to send it to another entity. It's called the Common Sense Initiative. It's a part of the Lieutenant Governor's office, and their responsibility is to scan the regulations for any impacts that would be made on businesses. So if you write a regulation that says, there's a fee for having to apply, right? You need to justify that fee, right? We need to say, here's why we are doing that, to the Common Sense Initiative. The Common Sense Initiative will come back and say, here's some recommendations, or this package is cleared for approval, and then you can submit it into the JCAR process. So that whole process, even there's the early parts before you get to JCAR, can take 30, 60 days for any particular set of rules or any particular set that you have. And that's not even counting the complexity that goes into each crafting of all of these things. Whenever you update rules for structure or security or floor plans or layout or testing or any of these, it requires sort of a very wholesome approach, because our role is not to, do the industry favors and make things simpler. Our role is to protect the public and to make sure that they are taken into consideration what they're doing and what they are putting themselves into as well. So you got 30 to 60 days on the front end before it even gets to JCAR. And then once it's in JCAR, and JCAR is the Joint Committee on Agency Rules and Regulations. It's a joint committee within the legislature, the Ohio State House, that looks at any rules that are promoted and scans to see, all right, are they meeting the statutory purpose? Are they exceeding the statutory authority that has been granted to them? Are they sort of out over their skis on any of this? And once that process begins, it's a minimum of 75 days before any rules can take effect. So between the drafting, the CSI process, and JCAR, you already have nearly 4 or 5 months that is just built-in time that it takes to write any of these rules. So when we're able to roll things out in June, it really is we accelerated that process very quickly and got through those stages. With the rest of the rules that we need to go through, there's more complexity and more layers that are built in. So it takes a little bit more time to kind of get through those procedures. That's a design of the system that Ohio has. It's meant to ensure that regulations are not overly burdensome, that they're not impacting businesses, they're not adding on additional layers, or that they're not exceeding the statutory authority that is granted. If we were to write a rule that, either didn't allow certain groups of people to make purchases, or like said, 21 is what the statute says, but we're going to restrict it to people that are under 25, that would be shot down by JCAR saying you've exceeded your statutory authority. So we need to be really careful on those lines, because getting sent back from JCAR resets your cycle. It sends you all the way back to the beginning. So a lot of care, a lot of thought, and a lot of craft goes into all of those elements before we can promulgate the rules, because we don't want to get reset. We don't want to get sent back to the beginning on any of it.
I think that's a lot of good insight. Shalene, let me ask you, as a former regulator, when we're kind of thinking big picture so far, just about where we stand on the policy front, what we've done so far, what there's left to do. You and Pat both kind of referenced a little bit of frustration in terms of, where we're at now. It seems like, again, lots been done, but there's still a lot to do. Is it common for the process to take this long in other states? I guess the question is Ohio moving any slower than other states? Are we moving faster? Are we about on par with where others are at? Can you give us any insight to that?
It looks to me like it's moving faster. I know it may not feel that way for people in Ohio, but I think it's moving very fast and clearly thoughtfully. And I'd also add just that we all have a tendency to complain when we're watching these things, myself included, but it's really important to remember that, when you don't see something being sent back to JCAR, that's the way it's been explained, when you don't see lawsuits filed down the line, when you don't see, recalls happening, the good regulation is really resulting in things that don't happen, and don't necessarily get acknowledged. So it's very important to recognize that, regardless of the speed. But that said, I think it's moving faster. But it's also important to note that I think this time early on, it's very common for people to obsess over the speed and the prices, because that's all you're seeing, and then the rate at which maybe new stores are opening or new dual use stores are opening. But down the line, those aren't necessarily the most important things for the long term. And so it's worth thinking, is it worth, if we save a few months right now, but we're excluding different communities, or we're making some kind of long-term bad decision, it's worth weighing those things.
Tom, I think I have a sense of maybe where you stand on this front in terms of where we're at today and where we're going. But from an industry perspective, and again, we're definitely going to come back to social equity. But how do industry operators feel about where we're at today? Are folks satisfied? Are folks frustrated because there's still some more rules to be put in place? I know I get a sense that a lot of people are still interested in rules for pre-roll products. They're interested, Andrew referenced this, but lightening some regulations in the advertising front. What's the industry perspective in terms of where we're at today? Are people pretty satisfied? Is there frustration? Maybe it's somewhere in the middle.
It's a great question, Jeremy. I think it's a relatively long answer. And as you know, I've got the Irish gift of gab. So I will try to sort of condense this a little bit. I think the industry is, they understand where we are at in the process, right? As Andrew mentioned, a year ago at this time, I thought we were looking at adult use sales starting at best in December of this year. Right, we beat that by 4 months. So from the industry perspective, there's a lot of gratitude for the folks at the division, not just for sort of prioritizing from a timing perspective, tranches of rules, as opposed to saying we're going to wait and we're going to launch the whole program all at once when the cake's fully baked, when all of the rules are fully written. Like, the division got creative in how it implemented and launched adult use sales. And that creativity and the speed at which they did that, there's a lot of gratitude in the space. And I will say, speed to launch of adult use sales is itself a consumer safety benefit, because that means you now have alternatives to the illicit market, right? You have alternatives to going to the gas station to buy intoxicating hemp products. It means you don't have to drive up to Michigan. So launching adult use sales quickly gave a safer, more regulated, tested, and taxed alternative to some of those other avenues to buy cannabis products. Obviously, as with any business owner, you're right, they move at the speed of light. Policy takes a little bit longer. That's a feature, not a bug, of the rulemaking process, right? Administrative regulations have the force of law. And that means that once they're final, we have to comply with them. And everybody always wants the government to move really quickly when they're doing stuff that they like. But the second they do something they don't like, everybody freaks out and says, whoa, 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 you got to slow down. And that's why during these rulemaking processes, right, like you start with feedback, you go to, through this review process so that people have an opportunity to provide feedback and comments on these rules. And again, the division has been very receptive to those comments sort of throughout this process. So I think the industry is, obviously they want to move faster, but there's also a ton of optimism. in the space right now. You know, I'm out at a conference in Las Vegas right now. The Marijuana Business Conference is one of these big industry conferences, and you hear people from Colorado and California and Oregon and some of these other markets that are overly saturated, where they have not done as good a job to stand up a functional industry. And they have been saying to me, like, wow, you guys got to be thrilled with how things are going in Ohio. I mean, hearing us talk about the stuff that's going on in California, right, where the taxes are too high, so they can't compete with the illicit market. People are going out of business. And when the market fails, that hurts everybody across the board. So I think deservedly, there's a lot of optimism from Ohio operators right now.
That's interesting that you're hearing from other folks who are saying, wow, you must be pretty happy with where Ohio is. Is Ohio like maybe, not to putting words in your mouth, but is Ohio kind of a leader in terms of policy and the speed at which we're getting it together? It seems like maybe we are.
I certainly think so. I know Shalene commented, and obviously she has a much better idea from a timeline to launch than I do. But, we did look at how long did some states take and how long did we take? There were a couple of states that launched an adult use program in 90 days, but they had a different framework than we had and how they launched that program and the avenues they had available to them. But you look at some other states, it took them a year or more before they had adult use sales begin. So Ohio is definitely a leader from an implementation standpoint. But then also, Ohio is not flyover country, right? We're the 7th largest state in the country by population. We're the 7th largest state by GDP. We have a robust economy. So it shouldn't really surprise anybody that our cannabis market will also be one of the top markets in the country as well.
So Kat, a question for you as we're looking at, moving forward, wearing your hat with the Drug Policy Alliance. What are your thoughts on, considering where we're at today and what we have left to do, what some of our priorities should be, and how do we sort of balance, the industry interests with kind of the broader public interests, with social equity and things of that sort?
Yeah, well, I think part of the challenge and really the opportunity that the state of Ohio has with implementing issue 2 is that, yes, regulators are tasked with standing up these first-time adult use markets, and that's a challenge in of itself. But the government has multiple responsibilities here, again, that extend far beyond the commercial market. And so I think that what I'd like to see the state of Ohio do is to continue to implement its cannabis program in ways that focus more on people and how people are impacted by the ongoing cannabis policies that exist. And I think that through the structure of the existing Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs program, there's infrastructure and foundation to do that particular work. The Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs program that exists in Ohio, I had mentioned previously, there's supposed to be, I believe, 36% of the tax revenue that's been generated going to community reinvestment at large. And this community reinvestment fund essentially is not only funding technical assistance and financial assistance for folks to be able to participate in the market, but is also supposed to be funding things like addressing the social and economic impacts of cannabis criminalization, and funding and studying things like expungement and criminal justice reform. And so I think that particularly now that we know that there are dollars rolling in, I'd be interested in seeing the state of Ohio prioritize and put together a plan for what the implementation of the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs program will look like. And similarly, I don't expect the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs program to be launched overnight. I know that these are things that take time, intention, and resources. And that's why I think it's important now for these things to start to be implemented and engaged in a transparent way so that stakeholders across the state of Ohio can begin to prepare and engage. There are folks all across the state of Ohio who are really interested in the implementation of these non-market pieces of criminal justice reform that were promised in issue 2, And I think that there's a real opportunity to start to seed these types of reforms through the cannabis tax revenues that have come in. I think I saw something a couple of weeks ago that said that the state of Ohio had raised close to $141 million in recreational sales to date. So there should be about $50 million already on the table to fund some of these community reinvestment measures. And I think that that's going to be particularly important. The other piece that I think is going to be important, I know that Ohio State University's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center has been doing a lot of excellent work in collecting and tracking data. I think that the state of Ohio has a role to do this as well. But there are lots of ways that cannabis policy will continue to impact Ohioans, whether it's understanding how cannabis policy impacts housing or employment or education or access to healthcare. And I think that these are issues that the state of Ohio should be prioritizing simultaneously as it's moving forward with its commercial market.
Andrew, I feel like this would be a good place to maybe flip it to you. Andrew, could you give us a sense just of, what are the priorities at the regulatory level? We're obviously talking a lot here about kind of balancing the industry interests, kind of the broader public interests, criminal justice reform. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit more about the social equity and jobs program. Can you give us a sense just how the regulatory body thinks about these priorities? Is one thing in front of another? And, can you give us a sense of when we might see some traction with the social equity and jobs program?
I'll do my best. And one of the things that I should mention, I'm a Division of Cannabis Control attorney. And as a result, the Department of Development has been tasked with the social equity program, the standing up of that program. I really don't want to speak
That's
for
a key
them.
point for sure.
That's something that I don't want to, either bind them in a particular way or sort of explain for them what's going on with those pieces. But I can do my best as far as the priorities that we're looking at. The first priority that we have kind of in the new year is the finalization of all of the adult use rules. Right now we have Rules Package 6 and Package 7 that are still working their way through the system. Rules Package 6 is on its way to CSI. Rules Package 7 is still in the early stakeholder feedback frame. And this is a large overhaul of the existing rules that are being operated under right now. So we are modifying or enhancing things when it comes to advertising, packaging and labeling, product registrations. We're trying to streamline some of those processes to make it easier for new products to find their way to the marketplace. And then we are also updating with a very large overhaul of the testing structure, the testing of cannabis. Again, there's some streamlines that are being implemented, but a lot of research has been done in the 5 or 7 years since the first rules packages were put together that says, no, there's this better way to conduct sampling to determine for potency. There's a more effective way to test for microbials or to test for heavy metals. So we're asking all of our testing labs to start getting up to speed on those two pieces. So our main priority is the finalization of those rules packages that sort of will build the program overall. After that, the next stage for us is going to be to start to implement other pieces of the statute that are under our control. One of those things is new licenses and whether or not new licenses are available. So the statute, the initiated statute, issue 2, put connected.
Yeah, you're still there. We lost you for just a second, but you're still
Okay.
there.
All right. I've snapped back. All right. I'm here. Hopefully you can all hear me. If somebody can't hear me, start raising hell. But the next stage for us is sort of the new licenses and what's going to happen with those. Issue 2 said that there is a 2-year stop on any new entrants to the marketplace, except for the 90 social equity licenses that are set aside. That's the only exception to these. So there are new license types that we're going to need to navigate and new pieces that we're going to have to put together. And that's sort of where a lot of our focus is going to go after we get the initial rules put together. And then the other side of it is it's the normal compliance behavior that you would expect from a regulator. Are there violations of either advertising or other rules that need to be addressed? Is there safety or health concerns related to these? Are there recalls that need to happen? Those types of things. So the normal regulatory drumbeat has to continue and has continued, since this has started. But those are kind of the main priorities that we have, is finalizing the rules, looking into what the new licenses will look like, where they need to go and how they're going to be stood up. And then the last piece is making sure that we're sort of continuing the mission of compliance and regulation.
Is there a sense of when folks could start applying for those social equity licenses? I understanding where there's still some work to do there. Are we talking about the end of next year, middle of next year? Is it just we don't know enough to know?
It's really hard for me to say. In the contact we have had with the Department of Development, I know that they are trying to put pieces of this together and design what that program would look like, but I don't have enough information about the details of what that would be to know what their timing ideas are. That's something that you'd sort of have to connect with them and see where their heads are at on it.
No, I respect that. Julie, let me ask you this as a former regulator yourself, and with us focusing a bit on the social equity piece of this, let's talk a little bit about how we do this right. What are some of the key things to keep in mind when it comes to the social equity and jobs program? Because right now we have a mandate, but some of the tax revenue towards standing this up. But I've seen some headlines myself about some of these programs just not going quite to plan in other markets, right? I think there was a headline I just saw this past week about a gentleman in New York who was kind of the face of the social equity program, and now he's at risk of losing his business. What are some of the lessons to be learned or cues that Ohio should be taking when it comes to standing up the social equity and jobs program in particular? And maybe you can tie that in with some of the issues that we've seen in other markets.
Let me come back to New York. That's an important point. But
Sure.
Thank you. That's a great question, Jeremy. So first I want to just clarify for everyone that we're usually talking about three different things. And the DEPC has several excellent reports that break down social equity and point this out. But we're usually talking about criminal justice, community reinvestment, and then industry participation, which can be jobs, licenses, or entrepreneurship training. I think that the most difficult to implement has been the industry participation. And again, a lot of that has to do with timing, because if you let other companies, large companies, medical companies, national companies, dominate the market first, it becomes nearly impossible for disadvantaged people to benefit economically. So that's the first thing. If that has already happened, which happened in my state and appears to be happening in Ohio, there's still creative things you can do, but I would still emphasize timing is really of the essence. I'll give you an example. So in Massachusetts, we also ended up implementing phased regulations, which I think turned out to be the right thing. So we started with, similar to what Andrew pointed out, the licensing, the opening of sales, and then moved on through the consumer safety related portions. And then we saved delivery and social consumption for later. When we decided to save it for later, we said that the social equity operators would get exclusive access to those licenses to make up for it, which sounds to me kind of similar to what was just laid out about how when the social equity or when the next licenses are approved, it will just be social equity. Okay, but here's what can go wrong, because what I just described was initially written in and passed as a draft by our commission in 2017. The social consumption, does anybody want to guess how many of those are open now? 0. And tomorrow, the commission is presenting the social consumption regulations that are very similar to what I wrote back in 2017. So when you don't have a sense of urgency, when you don't have deadlines, you can just completely lose track, no matter how much good intentions are put into exclusivity for social equity operators. So timing is everything. I would also say, I think we know at this point that just granting licenses doesn't do anything. Maybe early on when licenses were very limited, but now I think it's a good thing. They're generally, as a trend, easier to come by, just the license itself. And ideally, you're going to have a competitive, thriving market. And so in that case, you want to make sure that social equity operators have more. From the industry participation perspective, you want to make sure that they have access to grants and loans. You want to make sure that they have business training, technical assistance, fee waivers, or at least fee reductions. And then most importantly, the tracking of the data, as Kat mentioned. So I've been very pleased to see that not only do you have the DEPC in Ohio, which is a huge advantage, but that there's also taxes being collected and funds being set aside for that tracking and tweaking of the social equity program. Because the one thing we know for sure is no matter how hard you try, you're going to need to listen to people and to tweak down the line. So that'd be my advice.
No, that's great input. And I feel like maybe just driving the point home on something you're saying, when we think about equity in this sense, it doesn't mean just making licenses available to, disadvantaged people from disadvantaged groups in the past. It's making sure that they have the resources and the backing to make it, right? You don't want to just give a license to somebody who might not have the experiences or the experience and the resources to make it work. And I think that that's probably some of what you're referencing too, in terms of making sure that we have the resources in place to make sure that these folks can excel in the future and they don't just get a license and run into trouble. Kat, do you have anything? I saw you nodding while Shalene was talking. Do you have any thoughts? I guess the original question for her was more about how do we do this right? Are there lessons to be learned from other states? Any thoughts on what Shalene said or anything of that?
I often nod when Shalene is talking, just for the record. But I think that there are a couple of things that I think Ohio can do really intentionally. One is actually making sure that there's accountability to make sure that those tax dollars go where they're supposed to go. That's critically important. It seems like there still may be some discretion with the Department of Development and the eligibility criteria that it creates, for example, to determine who actually is able to participate and apply for these 90 licenses that will be available. As I understand, there are supposed to be 40 cultivation licenses specifically and 50 retail licenses. So I think that making sure that folks are well aware of when these opportunities become available, that there are resources in advance of the application process becoming available. That's critically important. I think that in a lot of these jurisdictions, the application process is open and then the resources become available. But the reality is that people need assistance both before, during, and after the application process. Operators will likely need assistance once they're operational. And so I think that these equity programs really have to be designed to meet folks where they are and get them through the licensing process and allow them to be successful in operation. But there are some market dynamics by design that are going to make it difficult for equity and minority entrepreneurs to be successful in Ohio. One of these market dynamics in reality is the fact that the existing operators were granted, first access to participate in the market and will have a period of time in which there is no competition. I think another thing that's important for folks to recognize with Ohio's market, part of the reason why I was able to get up to speed so quickly is that it essentially allowed folks who had existing medical licenses to get those adult use licenses. But it didn't just do that. It allowed, and Tom, I know you're more of an expert on the specifics here, but it allowed existing operators to get more licenses. And so as I understand, issue 2 allowed certain folks who only had one medical retail license to turn that one medical resale license into 3 retail licenses in the adult use market. And so Ohio has created a system where the haves are already going to have more before the have-nots have any. And that's just one example. Another example, we talked about these cultivation licenses that are available. There are 40 cultivation licenses that are available for social equity applicants. So I understand the canopy cap or the limit on square footage for those particular social equity applicants is 500 square feet. Or maybe is it 5,000 square feet, Tom? Okay, 5,000 square feet. Well, the level 1 cultivators are existing operators who are allowed to have up to 25,000 square feet of cultivation. And so it's difficult for me sometimes to look at, and not just Ohio's program, but other programs and say, we should actually be calling this an equity program. If we're saying that equity entrepreneurs only get 5,000 square footage of cultivation space, where existing operators get 25,000, and just the ratio of retail licenses to for equity applicants to non-equity applicants. To be frank, folks are already entering into a market where other operators have advantage, and I think that has to be accounted for as well. And so I think that this is part of the reality as we have been in communication with folks who are building these programs and have designed these programs ourselves to be frank in saying, this is not a lottery ticket. You are signing up to participate in a process that is and can be rife with challenges. And I think that the mandate with these equity programs is to really try and reduce barriers as they exist for operators as they're experiencing them.
Would mind jumping in there? Do you have any, I mean, as you know, a big force behind issue 2 and, you know, getting that social equity and jobs program sort of built into the law. Do you have any thoughts, you know, on what Shalene or Kat were saying, and or just any thoughts on how Ohio does this right and how we can make it work?
Jeremy, you cut out at the beginning. Was that a question for me?
Yes, I'm sorry, Tom. I was asking if you would mind weighing in a little bit on just how we make the social equity and jobs program work. How do we make it successful?
Yeah, happy to address it. And I forget if it was Shalene or Kat who mentioned the sort of 4 core like priorities, policy priorities of issue 2. And there's no doubt that social equity was certainly one of them. And, you know, I also agree, look, equity is about both representation and also restoration, right? So it's both participation in the industry as well as funding these sort of important equity initiatives. And we tried to do that as much as we could under issue 2. You know, remember that issue 2 is a ballot initiative, so you can only do so much given Ohio's single subject rule and this sort of just political realities of running a ballot campaign like that in a statewide campaign. You know, you can only be really so specific before the specificity becomes like a cudgel or a sword that gets used against you in a campaign. But let's talk, you know, generally about the social equity program. And Andrew's 100% right. Right now, the ball is squarely in the court of the Department of Development. I haven't heard of where things stand over there. I know that Commerce and the Division of Cannabis Control has done what it can do as far as social equity licensing goes. They promulgated a rule that says, hey, look, as soon as Department of Development launches this program and can certify folks, we can start an application period. And they now have the legal authority to do that. That was one of the very first rules that the division put into place. So from a licensing standpoint, as soon as that program is up and running, those licenses, that application process will be able to kick off. On the funding piece, remember that the way that sales taxes in Ohio get collected, they're sort of distributed every quarter in arrears. So we just had the first quarter of sales in the adult use program. Money will just now start moving. You know, the way it gets collected, there's a 10% tax at the point of sale, and it all goes into one bucket at the state. And then that bucket gets split up between, you know, 36% to the social equity and jobs program, 25% to substance abuse addiction, 36% to the local host community fund, and then the remainder goes to the division. So those funds will just start being available for those purposes. Kat is absolutely right. Accountability is key here to make sure that the tax revenue is used in the way that it was intended under issue 2. And there are sort of broad parameters about how that money gets used. You know, investment in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by marijuana prohibition, right? Direct investment. It's a quote from the language, and that was an intentional clause in issue 2, direct investment into those communities. Funding and studying criminal justice reform, bail reform, all of those important things, financial and technical assistance to social equity license applicants. The one thing that I have learned over the last several years, you know, kind of working in this space, both during the campaign, but also, you know, going through legislative fights, it seems like every year there's a new reform or corrections bill in our legislature to reform the marijuana industry. Policy is really hard. I think other people on this Zoom call kind of knew that way better than I did. And you constantly have to make kind of judgment calls and priorities. And so to me, speed to market was imperative because we wanted, again, to provide that alternative to the illicit market, but also so that we could start generating tax revenue. to fund the sort of restorative aspect of the social equity program. What we didn't want, and what I don't think Ohio voters would have supported, candidly, would have been an initiative that says, hey, in 3 years, we're going to have an adult use program, but we got to do all this rulemaking, we got to get all these programs stood up, et cetera. We kind of had to take the world as we found it. And unfortunately, under the medical program, there really was not a social equity licensing framework. The Social Equity and Jobs Fund, while most of issue 2 builds off of an existing framework, that Social Equity and Jobs program is brand new. And so we didn't want to delay the launch of the program to build that aspect. There are provisions in issue 2 where the division has an enormous amount of discretion. Kat mentioned cultivation area caps. Those caps, at the discretion of the superintendent of the Division of Cannabis Control, can be lifted. So the goal here really is to have a social equity program where our social equity licensees can be competitive with existing operators. And I can tell you, like, the existing operators would be a little surprised to hear that there's not any competition in Ohio's market. Like, if you ask them, the goal is to ensure that all of the licensees can be competitive, can be successful, because you also have to, at the same time, where you want participation in the industry, you don't want oversaturation. The superintendent at the division, Jim Canepa, has said, before, we don't want to be like Michigan where there's a 19% failure rate, right? Like it doesn't benefit anybody to have licensees closing their doors, going into receiverships, et cetera. So you want to, it's a balancing act. And it's going to take some time to kind of figure this out. But we absolutely need accountability. Totally agree. Social equity was a key component of issue 2. It's important that we know where that tax revenue is spent to make sure it's meeting the goals of the Social Equity and Jobs program and the statutory requirements. And it would be great to have, a round of social equity license applications, but unfortunately, we're kind of waiting on the Department of Development to launch that program and to certify participants so that the division can then go forward with its licensing process.
So maybe one more thing for you here. To what extent are there concerns for, you touched on this a little bit, to what extent are there concerns for lawmakers to change aspects of the adult use law now? I feel like we saw some, chatter in the State House about altering the law after issue 2 was passed. There seemed to be some interest in doing that earlier this year. That sort of seemed to fizzle out. The General Assembly obviously is going to conclude at the end of this year. So if there is anything that lawmakers wanted to put out there, we would imagine we'd see it early next year, right? Do you have any sense, Tom, of like what the appetite is in the State House to alter the law that's in place now, and what impacts we could maybe see from that?
Well, I stopped trying to predict what happens in the General Assembly a long time ago. But what I will say is that if you go back and look at a lot of the debate following the passage of issue 2, some of the proposals over this past spring, they largely centered around, oh my gosh, we have no idea how any of this stuff is going to work. Well, thankfully, the division now has rules in place, and we have a program that has been running for 4 months that has been relatively quiet from a compliance standpoint, right? The boogeymen have not showed up as we thought they never would. So we know how packaging is going to work, right? We know how advertising is going to work. We know how testing is going to work. We know how preventing sales to kids is going to work. And so my suspicion is that those concerns are now kind of off the table, right? So to the extent we see any modifications to what voters passed, I think we're really talking tinkering around the edges. The cat's not going back in the bag. Ohio has a legal adult use program. That program is here to stick around. We'll see obviously what happens in the General Assembly, but I think the market is in a really good place. The division has a very stringent set of regulations with more on the way to synthesize both the medical and adult use programs together under one whole regulatory framework. And that makes it easier for policymakers to say, okay, you know what, it's actually working okay. And that's similar to, candidly, also what we see at the local level, right? With local moratoriums, when city councils and trustees pass these bans because oh my gosh, we don't know what this is going to look like. Well, then they go tour a facility, they see, how the regulations work. After a couple of months, they see that it's fine. And in fact, it's a net benefit in their communities. So it's all about education, and it's about teaching people and showing them that we know how to do this in Ohio. We know how to do it well. We know how to do it safely.
Julie, let me ask you, do you have any sense of, or maybe the better question is there much concern with sort of lawmakers tinkering with the law today? And I'd be curious too, as kind of a part two to that, with your experience as a regulator, if that happens in other states. Like we have something the voters approved. Now we have politicians saying, okay, hold on, here's how I think we're going to reshape it. Do you have any sense of is that anything that concerns you? Should we be worried about that? You have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it depends on your legislature. So I'd defer to, everyone based in Ohio to say what the concerns are. But in general, yes, it's very common. I should acknowledge too, earlier when I said that I thought this speed was faster, I didn't measure it or do any research. I was just answering based on vibes. I think Tom would even know better than me, but I'm glad that we have like the same impression of it. And that is because in a lot of states, if it passes in November, there's some tinkering that has to happen, or that usually does happen by the legislature. And so seeing sales by August was really quick. But at the same time, even if it does delay things, I think it's generally a good idea to have a representative government take a look. I know in Massachusetts, I was one of the authors of the original ballot initiative, and I totally welcomed the rewrite by our legislature. I think it helped a lot. They made our regulating agency independent. They added a lot more equity provisions, and then they changed it again when we saw that municipalities were not acting right. They changed a lot of the accountability, and now they're probably going to change it even a third time. And I think that's generally a good thing. Could I talk about New York really quick? I wanted to mention that earlier.
Go ahead.
I saw that headline too that you asked about that said the face of something now his business isn't doing well. I've been amazed because New York is the only state where we did actually see a clear alternative to this problem I've been describing, where they let the larger operators move first. They were very intentional about not doing that. They did not let the existing medical operators go first. It did delay things a little bit. Not only did it delay things, we saw lawsuits like we've never seen before. We saw negative press, like a whole blitz, including articles like that, just to showcase New York as a failure. And then we saw political pressure causing the regulators to have staffing changes, people getting fired. All of that now in 2024, recent statistics show that 80% of the retailers in New York are independently owned by people with cannabis convictions. 45% of the businesses in New York are minority owned, 40% are women owned. Sorry, I got that backwards. 45% are women owned, 40% are minority owned. Just puts all the other states to shame. And so now I think, a few years ago when we were saying letting the larger operator go first doesn't work, now we can say doing the opposite does work.
Great points. I don't know if this is one that you could touch on too much, but the extent to which the regulatory agency is sort of impacted by any changes the lawmakers could make. Is this anything that would, concerns you folks when it comes to promulgating rules? And I guess I ask that because we're talking a lot here about setting up these programs right, doing them as quickly as possible. I think one might imagine that if we do have lawmakers tinkering with the law that's in place, that maybe that just slows things down. Is this anything that tends to be of a concern to DCC, or you guys just have your focus elsewhere?
It's a great question. It really is, because I think early on, especially between November of last year and December of last year, where the statute or the referendum had passed, but it actually hadn't become effective. We heard all sorts of ideas about what they're going to do, what they're going to fix, what they're going to change. And at that stage, I think we were a little bit worried, are we going to try to build something right now and then have it just like pulled out straight from under this. And that's always a little bit of a concern, but the way that we've approached this, and I think it's the only way that a regulator can, is we have to operate on the statute that's in front of us. And if the legislature comes in and changes a bunch of things on us, our job is to implement the statutes as they are written and as they are signed into law. And if that requires us to like restructure or redo things, we'll do that. But we didn't allow it to impact the way that we were building the program. Because, you know, the conversations about what to change and how to do it extended all the way, you know, even up to now, but all the way through, you know, June, July, August, as we are putting these things together. You know, a week before we launched applications, we heard, oh, well, they might change everything on you. And you can't allow that to be a focus or a way that you sort of implement it. Like, oh, if we only write it this way, or if we wait on this in particular, it might change. You sort of have to just keep driving forward. And I think that that's how we would approach this as well. You know, whether there's something that's done in the month of December or early next year that modifies things, we're going to continue to stick to the blueprint that we already have in front of us and continue to implement it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. If there are changes that come through the legislature, I think we'll have to explain, you know, here's why we're shifting course. It's because this new statute came in and it overrode what we were trying to do. It put us back to the beginning, but we have to just stay on course with what we have in front of us. And I think we've tried to do a really good job of that because, you know, Tom can tell you, I'm sure everybody knows, there's all the rumors that swirl around this. And as Tom said, you stop trying to predict what the legislature is going to do about any individual topic a long time ago. We really have to put the blinders on and just say, if it's given to us in this way, we are going to implement it in the way that it is written. And we're going to do the very best job with that we can. We're not going to allow the politics that swirl around it to impact the way that we're implementing the program, because, you know, the voters voted for this. This is what they gave to us. And we need to follow that as if it was anybody else.
If I could just ask you, just pivoting a little bit, we've talked about a few specific things. We talked a lot about the social equity and jobs program. As we kind of pan out a little bit and think about 2025, you know, Andrew touched a little bit on some of the rule packages that are in kind of working its way through the system now. Taking those into consideration or not, can you give us just kind of a perspective from your end in terms of what some of the other priorities are from a regulatory front that maybe we haven't talked about? You know, I think I mentioned the pre-rolls earlier. They're, from an industry perspective, that's probably something that a lot of operators want, as I understand that that's like a third of the market in some other states. The advertising restrictions, maybe that's a concern. From an industry perspective, what are, you know, operators sort of looking for in the near term?
Yeah, we do hear pre-rolls, a pretty consistent drumbeat about we need to get pre-rolls, we need to have those up and running. And the unique part of Ohio's system is because there was a medical program first, there's a statutory ban on combustion as a method of administering marijuana in the medical program that doesn't exist on the adult use side. So the way that we had framed it and what we've sort of tried to tell everybody is, while we still are operating under the medical rules until the full rule packages are adopted, you're stuck with this sort of limitation, right? And that also extends, pre-rolls are sort of the normal thing that people want to talk about, but it also extends to other product categories as well. And, you know, one of the things that the initiated statute did was it raised the THC content cap for concentrates, moving them from 70% under the medical program to 90% under the adult use program. Those products are not available yet because the new rules haven't been adopted. The main thing for all of those is, you know, Rules Package 6, which is on its way to CSI, has all of these concepts in it. Right, it's the next thing that's going to come through, and, you know, within a couple of months, I'm pretty certain that it will be implemented. You know, as long as JCAR doesn't throw us off. And then the package that follows that is the testing package, the testing of all of these particular things. And for concentrates, there's not a whole
I think maybe
testing, but when you are introducing a new, so we have to design a system around how we're safe, you know, tested, meet the standards that are set, so that somebody that uses a product that is bought straight off the shelf doesn't end up with a bunch of contaminants in it as well, from a slightly different vector. So pre-rolls are on the way. They're
I'm tempted to joke that there's somebody really out there trying to make sure Ohio doesn't get pre-rolls, so Andrew gets cut off every time you start talking about it. But Jeremy, you're doing a great job keeping up with some tech issues.
sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew. I'll let you finish up. I wanted to make sure everybody knew we had about 10 minutes left, so we get to some closing remarks and wrap things up with what's been a spectacular conversation so far.
Sure. I'll cut myself off to this. Pre-rolls are on the way. All the new product categories are on the way. They're in the next rules packages that are being finalized, and they should be implemented relatively soon thereafter. And that, that is the implementation of all the things that are listed in the initiated statute. That includes advertising. There's an update to the advertising rules. There's some updates that are going to be surrounding packaging and labeling that kind of go along with that. So you're going to see a lot of the, the reins that were put in sort of loosened a little bit, and there's going to be more freedom given to the operators because there's a distinction between the medical program and an adult use program.
Andrew, thank you very much for explaining all that. By way of maybe some final thoughts, maybe Kat, Shalene, and Tom, maybe we could go in that order. I'm just curious if you folks have any final thoughts or takeaways, for anyone who's paying attention to this, about what we should be expecting in the coming year, what you're hoping for in the coming year. It maybe a prediction about where you, or a wish of where you'd like Ohio to be by this time next year. Any of those things, you don't have to answer all that stuff, but just some things to consider by way of some final comments. Kat, you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Jeremy. And I want to thank the Center for organizing this and hopefully continuing to put on educational meetings and things for the public to learn more about what's happening in Ohio. I think my hopes for Ohio's program is that it's implemented equitably, that we'll actually see the manifestation of the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs Program. We can see dollars coming from cannabis tax revenue to fund criminal justice reform and to help get minority and equity entrepreneurs off the ground. I think the other piece of this is Ohio has an opportunity, because it's the 24th state, to learn from other jurisdictions as it moves forward with this program. And I think one of the most important lessons learned really is about just government accountability generally, making sure that there's transparency in the implementation of the program. And I guess part of what I'm also hopeful to see in Ohio are people in Ohio, community-based organizations in Ohio getting involved with the implementation so that we can make sure that there is accountability. I know, for example, with the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs Program, there's supposed to be an advisory council. And so I think that there are lots of opportunities for folks who are interested in tracking and engaging with this issue. But there's a lot of opportunity for growth and improvement. And as a Buckeye myself, I'm very interested in making sure that Ohio continues to do this the right way.
Shalene, for you, any final thoughts, final takeaways, hopes for the coming year, predictions for where we might be at this time next year? What do you think?
I love Ohio in general and its place in cannabis. I think that there's a couple of really important historical roles that Ohio has played in cannabis. One being that Kat and I often get credit for being the first to implement equity programs, but Ohio was actually the first to try with the racial quota system with its medical program. And yes, it was struck down, but they deserve credit for trying first. And we learned a lot from that case. So they deserve credit there. Also, the people of Ohio really bucked a trend in 2015 by rejecting the ballot initiative that would have created a monopoly. That just happened again in Florida, or an oligopoly. So I really appreciate both of those things. And I think that Ohio is going to be a leader now in implementation as well, especially when it comes to collecting data. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how research implements or affects what happens here. Just real quick, a prediction for the future. I think the era of legalization that started in the early 2000s is kind of the one characterized by a diverse group of industry and advocates and scholars all kind of coming together. I think it's ending, unfortunately. I think we're starting to see the beginning of a backlash. I think we really need to listen to people about how they're experiencing legalization and what needs to change. And I think Ohio could play an important role in that.
Thank you. Tom, how about you? Any final thoughts, key takeaways, hopes or predictions for the coming years? What do you think?
Yes, well, I'll give you a hope. I've said a lot of nice things about the government on this webinar. It's too much. So my hope in 2025 is that the feds get the hell out of the way on cannabis and let the states continue to lead on this issue, because that will also help drive a lot of the important considerations, to sort of raise all boats throughout the industry. So my hope and my wish for 2025 is that we actually see final, at least rescheduling of marijuana under federal law, if not, removal of marijuana from the list of controlled substances entirely, the enactment of something like the States Act, co-sponsored by Ohio's own Dave Joyce, or any of the other number of reform initiatives that have been presented at the federal level.
Andrew, the last one, and I'll refine it a little bit more for you if I could. As somebody, working in the regulatory side of things, how about a prediction on where we will be at this time next year? In whatever terms it makes sense for you. Maybe a sense of where we would be on the policy front, or something that you want to be able to say about the program at this time next year.
Sure. I think my hope for next year is that all of the new dispensary licenses we have, both the social equity and the ones that have sort of been through the licensing process already, are up and operational, right? They've gotten themselves into sites that they're happy with, and that we have, a lot more access that's available. One of the things that we talk about a lot in terms of combating the black market and allowing for opportunity is you need to have a lot of locations covered. That's one of the reasons why we implemented sort of 1 mile buffers around dispensaries and tried to push people out into the different spaces. So I'm hoping that all of the licenses that are available, both in the social equity and in the program as it is, are up and operational. We can see sort of what a fully saturated market looks like. Saturated isn't really the right word, but a sort of all of the licenses are operational at that particular time. So that would be my kind of hope. I think if we could see that by December of next year, I think that would have been a pretty successful year from our standpoint, if all of these pieces kind of coming together. Beyond that, I think, I'm really hopeful that my staff gets a little bit more sleep this year. We've been really burning the candle on both ends, and I really appreciate everybody. I mean, it's really nice to hear from the industry and from everybody that's outside saying we have a lot of empathy. We understand what you guys are going through, because a lot of times it doesn't feel that way. Like they said, there's always kind of this push to get things out the door and through. We burned a lot of hours, we put in a lot of time to get things where they are, and it's going to take a lot more when we get there. But if by December of next year things have sort of calmed down sufficiently that we don't need to continue taking comp time, I'll consider that a success too.
Excellent. Doug, I'd flip it back to you after just saying thanks to the Drug Enforcement Policy Center for having us all on to chat today.
I appreciate that, and I want to say thanks to you, Jeremy, and to everybody involved in the webinar and all the attendees as well. I'll add to the a year from now prediction is that I'll certainly want to make sure we do an event like this again to see where we are in another year, and I know all the folks involved here will help us make it a good year by some metric, if not necessarily every single one that everybody hopes to see happen. And again, just incredibly grateful for the work that you all are doing in all your spaces, and want to also encourage everybody attending to remember the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center is going to continue to try to do its work. Thanks for all the nice shout outs along the way. We're going to do what we can to both keep an eye on this and to deepen the discussion. I think, Kat, you particularly mentioned that I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding both in the state and around the country. And Shalene, I especially think your point about kind of listening to folks in this space, not only is so important strategically, but what we hope we're able to do through the center and help channel the voices of many of you working here and all those in communities that care about these issues. So with that, thank you again very much for participating. I learned a lot. I trust everybody else did as well. And I hope I see all of you before this time next year. And please do reach out, both panelists and attendees, to folks at the center, because we're always eager to hear what issues you think are important, and we'll try to prioritize those that the community wants to hear more about and be part of that process. Thanks again. Appreciate it. Have a good year, all the holiday cheer and all that goes with it as well. And stay safe out there. And thanks again for participating. We'll call this a day.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much.